welcome to our Building Energy Code seminar series. The series is based on our National Energy Codes Conference, which is hosted annually by the U.S. Department of Energy. We're here to present you with the latest in building energy codes, from developments in the model codes, to updates on what's happening across states and local governments, to highlighting tools and resources that you can take advantage of in your day-to-day practice. We'll be hearing from a number of leading experts about the challenges they're facing, ways they're working to solve them, and how their efforts are building the energy efficiency, comfort, quality, and affordability of America's homes and businesses. Join us virtually every week for important topics and interactive discussions, and help us continue the conversation. To learn more, visit energycodes.gov.
Hello everyone, my name is Ian Blanding and I'm with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'd like to welcome you to today's seminar, which is part of the National Energy Codes Conference seminar series. This seminar we're going to be talking about advanced technology and the role of building codes. Before we turn things over to our speakers and kind of moderator, so this is going to be a moderated discussion, so please come with questions and really look for a lively discussion today. But looking ahead in the seminar series, we have two more seminars yet to come. So next week, we're going to be talking about policies for energy efficiency and resilience. And then the following week, on the 17th, we're going to be talking about field studies in the Northwest region. You can find out more at the link below, where you can also look for recordings. A PDF to this today's presentation is available there, and you'll find a lot of good content up there. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Chris Burgess with the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance to get us started.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thanks for joining us. You may have seen earlier that Allison Lindberg was going to be facilitating. Unfortunately, Allison is not going to be able to join us today, but I will do my best to fill her wildly talented shoes. As Ian said, my name is Chris Burgess. I'm the building director at the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and we'll be facilitating this discussion. We're going to go, I'll give you some order of this is going to go. Next slide, please. As I say, we're going to launch a couple of polls for the audience, then I'll introduce the speakers and we will move on to the discussion. Next slide. All right, here's our first poll. Just want to get a sense of where people are from. Oh, very nice distribution in general. Great, not many participants from the Southeast, but otherwise a nice even distribution. Thank you. Next slide, Nicole. And then we sort of what you do for a living or what interest you might be. No builders. Okay, but otherwise, again, a nice balance between others. Great. Thank you. Next slide, Nicole. So advanced technologies are, entering buildings at a rate we've never seen before, really testing and expanding the roles and abilities of building codes to accommodate them. These increases are coming from the consumer market. Sometimes they follow local policies to improve resilience or energy efficiency. We're looking forward to today's discussion session to explore the impacts and opportunities between advanced technologies and building codes. Our panelists will be setting the stage with brief presentations on solar and EV-ready codes, grid interactive efficient building technologies and codes, and considerations in code for energy storage. After those presentations, there'll be a few more polls, and we will move to the interactive discussion about our topic. And we really do want to hear from you, so type your questions into the chat box if you'd like to speak, and we will either get to the question or call on you to speak yourself. Next slide, Nicole. Our speakers here, it's a great group. I will read their introductions here and then we'll start the presentation. Scott Prisco is the building official for the city and county of Denver. His career has spanned both public and private sides of development, design, and construction. He is a LEED accredited registered architect, most recently serving as Director of Design and Construction for Arlington, Virginia Public Schools. He headed up the district's ambitious capital improvement program. Prior to that, Scott owned an architecture firm in New Jersey and has designed myriad buildings, including the Microsoft School of the Future in Philadelphia, as well as several projects in the United Kingdom. As Denver's building official, Scott is responsible for applying and enforcing the Denver Building Code to ensure the safety of all buildings in Denver. He oversees plan review, permitting, and inspection services, and will be working to improve customer service on all projects, big and small. After Scott, we will hear from Chris Perry. Chris conducts research to support energy efficiency building codes and equipment standards, as well as smart grid and interactive buildings. As a member of ACEEE. He joined ACEEE in 2015. Prior to that, Chris worked at URS Corporation in Ohio as an energy management engineer, and most recently in Virginia as a sustainability consultant at JDM Associates. Chris is a registered professional engineer, a LEED accredited professional, building design and construction, as well as a certified energy manager. He earned his master's in engineering management from Georgetown and a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from Penn State. And our last presenter will be Beth Tubbs. She is a senior staff engineer with the International Code Council. Beth is actively involved in a wide variety of activities, including code development support and representing ICC in various national and international committees. She is staff secretariat to the International Fire Code and the International Existing Building Code. She is the lead on ICC Fire Code Action Committee, which has been dealing with topics such as exterior wall finishes and claddings and energy storage systems. Beth is a fellow of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers and president-elect for 2021 for the Society. She holds a professional fire protection engineering license in both the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in the state of California. And with that, we will get to our presentations. Scott, you're up.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Chris. Really excited to be here and part of this presentation. In terms of presentation, I'll give an overview of some big picture goals in Denver and then touch on the EV and renewables that codes and ordinances that we're dealing with. The slides are not advancing, not sure what's happening. Let me see, there we go. So some of the big picture sort of community goals and priorities that we've established in Denver, response to climate change and equity are right up there at the top, and affordability. And we realize when we're looking at those big picture goals, the sustainability, equitability piece of that is that it's really at the center of the environment, social, and economic realms that any city or county deals with. It's really at the core. We've been really ambitious in Denver, and the mayor in 2018 established a 80 by 50 action plan whereby 80% of the greenhouse emissions will be reduced from a baseline of 2005. A community-based initiative that we established this year is actually trying to move that forward to 2040. Very ambitious. It has not been approved yet by City Council and Mayor, but that's where the recommendations are from this community-based group. All of the initiatives that we do, we really have a robust interaction and dialogue with the community, from our 80 by 50 plan to our net zero energy goals, which were at 2035 and are now starting to target 2030 implementation, as well as some very aggressive electric vehicle charging initiatives. And all of those are happening through code amendments, ordinances, regulations, policies, guidelines. We've even adopted a stretch Denver Green Code at this point. When we look at our emissions, our greenhouse emissions, the buildings take up the lion's share of our emissions. There's 30% that happen through transportation, and the lion's share, obviously, through commercial facilities. I'll start with electric vehicle charging, and we're looking at having electric vehicles by 2030, 30% of vehicles to be electric, and by 2050, all light-duty vehicles. So they're pretty ambitious goals. We have some challenges, obviously, with the chargers and whatnot, and that's why we're putting forward ordinances and codes to help ramp those initiatives up. We were fortunate to win, the mayor won an award, the Plug in America Drive Electric Award. Very proud of the advancements that we've made with electric vehicle charging. Some of the mandatory components that we have in our codes now, which in Denver were local rules, so we get to, we have our base codes, the IECC and IBC and all the ICC codes, our base codes, and then we make amendments to those. In the IECC, we made an amendment for electric vehicle charging, and there are 3 criteria that need to be met. You have to create EV ready, EV capable, and EV installed. Essentially, EV ready is everything's ready to go, conduit, conductors, everything except for the charger. Capable is conduit and room on the panel, and installed is actual having chargers required. So when we look at when do we mandate these? For all new construction projects now, this is required. Any level 3 alteration, meaning you're impacting 50% of the building. Parking spaces added or modified, then this is required. For single family and duplex projects, there has to be one EV ready space provided for every new single family or duplex project. These are current codes now in our 2019 Denver Building Code amendments. You can see that we have a percentage in every project, both multifamily and commercial. We actually pushed multifamily projects into our commercial IECC projects. So if it's a multifamily, it's actually part of the commercial IECC. One of the changes that we made, an Errata was required for our projects because we had originally started to look at what was required in zoning. Those are the spaces that we would look at in terms of mandating EV chargers. And it was an oversight on our part because in the central business district, we don't require parking. So that was an unintended consequences that we had to sort of fix in our Errata that's coming up over this next month. In terms of renewable energy, we're looking at 100% renewable by 2030. We have very ambitious goals in Denver and in Colorado, and we're trying to push these initiatives forward. Part of that and it is starting off with Denver, the 31 public sites that publicly owned properties, where we're going to be having those sites put on solar panels by the city and county of Denver, and then they're shared to the community. Another initiative that we have is that we are trying to really advance solar projects, both residentially and commercially. So we're expediting those with a 2-day review, and we cap out any permit fee for any solar project to be at $50. Residentially, we're mandating that there's an area for PVs on the roof, and it has to be a clear area and a conduit provided with the clear. And when we do have PVs, we're following the 2018 so that we mandate all the fire access in the case of a fire event. We also have a green building ordinance that was recently first initiated by voter initiated ballot, and then it was modified because it wasn't written quite for Denver. It was really taken from a Canadian ordinance. And council, we work with community and revamped it. But you can see that there's when you have a new building, you have to not only pass the I codes in our Denver Building Code Amendment, but you have to meet the Green Building Code, or the Green Building Ordinance, which has solar requirements in it as well. Even for existing buildings, if you're going to do a re-roof project, you have to meet that ordinance, which again, one of the options is solar panels. We also have, as I had mentioned, we have an optional Denver Green Code, part of our new most recent adoption. And there are a couple paths to get there. You could be LEED Platinum, you could be net zero energy, you could be Passive House, plus some of the other chapters. You take away the energy chapters in the IGCC, or you just follow our green code. So we're really excited about that. Some of the future things that we have in our code coming up with, we're doing our code amendment process again in 2021. We're looking at mandating renewables. And if you can't do them on site, then we'll have an off-site, the community solar fund that you can be contributed to. Residentially, we're looking at requiring very aggressive ERI scores, and then we're also looking at required PVs. So renewables are an important part of us moving forward for a community and mandating a certain percentage of projects to have renewable energy. And this slide, this will be my last slide. I have a lot of resources that I've included, but this will be my last slide. And a lot of times I like to look at the code as, we're sort of pulling people up the mountain with our requirements. And ideally, it would be great if there was a paradigm shift where the market and the community were driving that, and we're following, or maybe we're on level field. It's always harder when we're sort of pulling folks in that direction. And ideally, and hopefully soon, there's a paradigm shift where folks wanting homes or purchasing homes are going to want that net zero home or that LEED accredited commercial building, preferably a platinum level. So those are the directions that Denver's heading in, very aggressive. And thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this event.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of sort of clarifying questions come in. One asks, how does Denver define multifamily? Or are you?
Sure. So in the IECC, there are multifamily could be IBC or IRC based on if it's less than three stories or less, or 4 stories or more, or depending on how the property line is. We consider all multifamily now part of our commercial, and we made that amendment. So that criteria puts you into the commercial International Energy Code
Right.
for Denver. So only single family and duplex projects are considered under the residential side of the IECC.
Okay. Thanks. And I think we have another poll to launch. Nicole? Yeah. How many of you are driving? Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are just questions to get a feel of the audience of how relevant we're pushing and with the audience if they were going to be buying or considering purchasing an electric vehicle in the coming months. Very interesting. So it's a little bit less than 50% would consider or thinking about it or have one. Very good. And I think there was one other poll, which is about solar panels. If your jurisdiction has any expedited plan review or has a fee reduction, or a cap on their fee for solar panel projects. All right, so not as many as I thought. So this is something that I think is working really well in Denver. We're getting huge numbers of solar panels, and it's sort of exponential every year. We're getting more and more every year, and I think that's a big part of it, that we are trying to help the solar industry through expedited plan review and fees.
Great, thank you. We had a couple other questions come in, but I'm going to hold those until after the presentations. So Chris, you're up.
All right, great, thanks. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come talk about a couple of things that are pretty near and dear to our hearts at IECC, grid interactive efficient buildings and energy codes, and what the synergies between them are and overlaps. I think Scott's last slide where he talked about a paradigm shift is a really good segue and kind of introduction into what we're going to be talking about now, because I think that could be a term used to describe GEBs, and we'll talk more about that. So next slide. So this is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give a brief overview of GEBs, what they are, just in case anybody's confused about the terminology there. I'll talk about a couple enabling policies to keep an eye on. Then we'll talk about GEBs in energy codes and talk about ASHRAE, IECC, California, and LEED, and then some key resources for you, and then takeaways at the end. So next slide. All right, so a little bit of background for everybody here. So IECC, we are traditionally an energy efficiency research organization. So we've been mostly interested in reducing the overall energy load. And next slide. So what we're starting to become more interested in is the bigger picture. It's not just how much energy you're using, but also when are you using that energy, and if does it need to be reduced at certain times? Can you shift that to a different time, or can you modulate in response to the needs of the grid? So these are becoming larger issues. We'll talk about why that is. Next slide. So we're seeing some major trends going on right now. Most notably, we're seeing a lot of adoption of electric technologies. We're seeing renewable energy like solar PV come online. A lot of people are starting to adopt things like electric vehicles and heat pumps and other technologies like those. And then there are policies that also support these technologies. So, namely electrification and decarbonization type policies. And the most classic example of the animals listed here is on the left is the California duck curve, an example of grid strain. So, in non-COVID times, this is how it would work. But essentially, in the middle of the day, you'd have a lot of solar renewable energy, and not a lot of need for electricity from the grid. But then at the end of the day, when the sun is setting and people are coming home from work, there all of a sudden is this spike in energy demand from the residential sector. It creates a lot of strain on the grid, and it's really difficult for utilities to deal with. And it's dangerous, could cause blackouts. So so that's the classic example. There are other examples depending on where you are. Midwest, those curves are less pronounced because wind energy is a little bit more stable and throughout the day, but it still causes some uncertainty. And Hawaii's NECC curve is kind of like California's duck curve, just a little flatter at the beginning and maybe a more pronounced ramp at the end. Next slide. And so what are we talking about when we talk about grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs? So the way that we define them, they are highly efficient buildings that can communicate with and act as a resource for the grid. So what that means is two things. One, there's the more traditional energy efficiency aspect of these buildings. So they have high efficient windows and walls, HVAC systems, lighting systems. But then on the other hand, there's this grid interactivity component where the buildings contain distributed energy resources, which we shorthand to DERs throughout this presentation, that can communicate with the grid, that can reduce or shift load on the grid. So that could be connected HVAC systems, connected water heating systems, solar and storage, or electric vehicle charging stations, resources like that. Next slide. Okay, so we'll talk quickly about a couple enabling policies for GEBs that I think it's important for everybody to be aware of and keep an eye on. So the first is California Senate Bill 49. California has said that they want to see a flexible demand appliance standards. So talking about appliance and equipment in buildings, they really want to see that it can provide these demand flexible like capabilities to the grid and act as a resource. And so we're starting to see that shift since California passed this bill. Next slide. And then another one that came out fairly recently, so FERC's Order 2222, I think this was just in like September of this year. FERC announced that they, what they're trying to do with this order is to open the wholesale markets to distributed energy resources. So they want the resources we talked about, whether it's solar and storage or grid connected water heaters or whatever it is, to be able to kind of compete in the market with more traditional, like if a utility is going to construct a new power plant or add new distribution lines, if you can compare those to economics, then it really gives a lot more opportunities to these GEB resources and GEB technologies. And so the way that this is going to work, RTOs, regional transmission organizations, and ISOs, independent system operators, are taking the lead. They're convening utilities, aggregators, regulators, other stakeholders that are important for this. Their filings are due in July of 2021. And this isn't directly related to codes, but it's, kind of like Scott was talking about, this could be part of a larger paradigm shift where this becomes the norm. We have buildings that are connected. They are resources for the grid. Next slide. All right, so now let's get into codes. So we'll start with ASHRAE. ACEEE, we're members of the standard, the 90.1 committee, mechanical subcommittee. So we're directly involved in this. So I think something that's really noteworthy is in February of this past year, the 90.1 committee voted in favor of considering time of use rates in the cost effectiveness of new proposals. So if you are considering when the energy is used, looking at those kilowatts, instead of just kilowatt hours, it can really help justify the cost of some of these technologies. So we have an energy storage working group that we're also involved in that is currently looking at different measures to include in the 2022 version of the code. And we think this is a great chance to try out these time of use rates where Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL, is doing a lot of the analysis to figure out what the time of use rates look like. One thing to note about a challenge here is figuring out, what is a representative time of use rate for the whole country, because it really varies a lot depending on where you are. So, if you have an average time of use rate that we're using for this, it may not represent an area like New York City where time of use rates, are much different, and something like energy storage would be more justified in an area like that than in other parts of the country. So I just have a question here. How can our model codes help support the needs of different jurisdictions? Don't have an answer for it, but I think it's an important thing to consider. It could maybe come as optional appendices or doing more work at local and jurisdictional levels to figure out what works best for them. So there's both this component, this national and this local component. Then I wanted to mention too the stretch code, standard 189.1. No, it's not a code, it's a standard, but semantics. We're not directly involved in that, but our friends at New Buildings Institute are, and we coordinate with them and talk to them about what they're doing. So I wanted to mention some of the work they're doing in this area. Automated demand response measure for the 2020 version of the code. And then for 2023, they're exploring a whole host of GEB type measures. So demand response requirements, including protocols for connectivity, time of use metrics, I think something else about commissioning GEB technologies. So a lot going on there. Next slide. So that was ASHRAE, and now let's talk about the IECC. So IECC has not quite embraced GEB technologies and DERs the way that ASHRAE has. I think a good example of that is for the 2021 IECC process, 3 proposals that had pretty significant components were GEB related. All were overturned by the IECC board. So there was a proposal on high efficiency and grid connected water heating systems, electric vehicle ready requirements that are very similar to what Scott was talking about in Denver, which would have been in residential and commercial buildings, and then electrification ready requirements. So all 3 of these were, the members voted on these in the final action vote for the IECC, and they passed in like overwhelming numbers. But then during the appeals process, some groups like National Association of Home Builders, APGA, and others appealed and said, these don't belong in the code. Made arguments for them. ICC found those arguments compelling and essentially nullified these ones. So we were disappointed. To me, they would represent a step forward for GEBs in the IECC, and it seems like it's not there yet. So next slide, please. And then a couple other that we can draw on here are California Title 24 and LEED. So Title 24, which I'm not, our organization, we're not super involved in, but it's really, it's good to keep on top of what California is doing with their code, which can be a model for others. So in 2019, they include automatic demand shed control, demand responsive controls, and demand responsive electronic messaging control center. And then 2022, considering demand responsive lighting systems, heat pump water heaters, and thermal energy storage systems. So a lot of relevant technologies there. And then LEED is piloting a grid harmonization credit for up to 3 points, which is using New Buildings Institute grid optimal metrics for valuing grid flexibility. You can earn up to 3 points that way. What they're placing value on are things like grid peak contribution, grid carbon alignment, short-term and long-term demand flexibility. So it's calculating all those, and then you can earn more points if you improve those metrics. So a pretty neat pilot to keep an eye on. Next slide. All right, so some high-level takeaways here for everybody. So GEBs, I made the case here, GEBs can really help mitigate the strain and provide energy emissions and utility bill savings. Building codes have traditionally valued energy efficiency and not demand flexibility. However, we're starting to see a shift, definitely more so in ASHRAE right now, and we're working to try and make that the case in the IECC as well. And we can look to California's Title 24 and stretch codes and certification programs like LEED for helpful examples of GEB measures. And then I think one big takeaway here would be that just recognizing the value of demand flexibility really takes us out of that old paradigm for energy codes where it's only energy efficiency, and we can look also at the impacts on the grid when you use energy, and that seems like it's a really key step here into recognizing these as an important part of the code. And with that, that's it for me.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. And I think we have a couple more polls. Nicole?
I think I have just one for the next one. Oh, maybe this is for this one.
What technologies you're most interested in? Choose your top 3. This is going to be interesting. A lot of interest in battery storage and solar PV, and groupings around everything else, electric vehicles, thermal storage, HVAC controls, grid appliances. Interesting. not much interest in electric water heaters. Okay. Yes, and now we're going to move on to our last presenter, Beth Tubbs.
Thank you.
Take it away, Beth.
Thank you. I wonder if we could just do my poll now, because it will sort of lead into the discussion a little bit later. Thank you. I actually had a hard time coming up with the poll question. This was, as you know, I'm a fire protection engineer, so energy admittedly is not quite my thing. I'm very interested in it. I'm very interested in climate change and all of those issues, but my area is in fire safety. So what I want to do, if you could go to the next slide. What I want to do, I'm just going to talk about sort of two different things. My perspective, of course, is going to be a little different. I hope I don't sound like the negative aspect of this. I just really thinking about this more holistically, and just different events and things that have happened, and also try to give a sense for outside of the energy code and ASHRAE, and how are we addressing some of these technologies. Ironically, the energy code doesn't talk about energy storage systems, but the fire code does. So I know that probably hopefully will change in the future, but I want to put it from the perspective of regulating it to make sure that it works correctly and be used for the purpose that it's needed for. So the perspective I'm looking for is more about safety of its operation versus the need from an energy standpoint, although, like I said, I'm very interested in that topic. And also by the signs of the other presentations, this is going to become more and more popular. We're going to see, for instance, energy storage installations far more frequently than we do now, to become more sustainable in what we do. So I'll be talking about a couple examples and then talking about the provisions a little bit briefly. Oh, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So I think the biggest thing is to look at this as a delicate balance. That fire safety is something this is part of the reason why we created building codes, the fire in Chicago, fire in Boston, London, all these places. This is where we came up with a lot of the provisions that ended up in today's building codes, which keep getting thicker and thicker. But it's important, though, it doesn't always necessarily go along with some of the other objectives. There's various things we do. It's not just about fire safety or structural safety. It's about accessibility, which is a civil rights issue, energy, which is an environmental issue. But it gets kind of complicated balancing all these things. And I think my big theme is that we need to balance this. And what's interesting, just the other day, the National Fire Protection Research Foundation through NFPA released a report by Brian Meacham and Margaret McAmney from London University. Brian's from the US. And he's a fire protection engineer as well. And it's talking about sort of the fire safety and the green attributes or green aspects of buildings. It goes through all sorts of topics. But they were kind of looking at it as we need to have an attitude of sustainable and fire resilience, because you don't want a fire taking something that we absolutely need for society and making people nervous, not wanting to implement the technology, or putting firefighters at risk, occupants at risk as we're putting these systems in homes. We don't want that to derail the direction that this industry would like to go in. Plus the fact that if you want resilient power grids and everything, we don't want to lose those resilient pieces in a fire explosion. So just kind of thinking about this. Next slide, please. This first example is actually not energy storage or generation issue. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this fire. It became part of my life for a while because they told me I would be answering a lot of media calls, so it was an interesting process to kind of go through and learn a lot. But this happened in the UK. It was an existing building that they had put cladding on, energy efficient cladding. And you have to understand, high-rises in the US since the 80s have been sprinklered. The UK has not had that quite the same culture of that, and they've also had much more of a stay in place and passive fire protection. So it was a total catastrophe. And it also revealed a lot about the regulatory system in the UK at the time. It had been so deregulated, that was part of the issue. So there's a whole host of reasons this went badly, but I think it's a perfect example of not balancing the fire and sort of energy sustainability issues. Because of this, I mean, they've undone their entire regulatory system. They've banned combustible cladding, which sounds great from a fire safety perspective, but I understand there's realities. Energy is expensive, and it's part of having, you know, the bigger picture of it all. We can't just ban these materials that we need to be able to achieve our other goals. So they kind of lost out. In the US, we haven't kind of gone that far because we've kind of looked at it, ironic, a little bit more performance-based, but an example of how this could work against us. Next slide, please. So this one, you probably may have heard about this one. It was, you know, out there quite a bit, and maybe it's because the circles I'm in, I hear about it a lot. And just recently, UL actually did a nice study through their Fire Service Research Institute, did a study, a timeline of this event. This is one slide. They have a much longer presentation. But the issue here was this installation was built before our codes really addressed some of these issues in terms of what was adopted in that jurisdiction. And 4 firefighters were basically, after there was an explosion because of hydrogen gas buildup, and they flew about 50, I remember how far, but pretty far away from the unit, and were injured and seriously, and they were hospitalized for a little while. And then some were, I don't think they actually ended up being exposed to, but they made sure to make the check that they were exposed to hydrogen cyanide. So this is, of course, is not the best, you know, image to have of coming from a unit like this. Granted, this doesn't happen every day, but I think it's an example of where we need to think about this to make sure that we're all on the same page and getting everything achieved so we don't see these kinds of things. Part of the problem with this is that they did a lot, there was a lot of systems in there that were good. There was, it's not that they skipped out on a lot of things, but there was no gas detection, and there was no, that fire suppression agent they used, it actually activated. The problem is lithium ion batteries have thermal runaway issues that traditional sort of fires, once you put the suppression you know on it, it doesn't kind of reactivate in a sense spontaneously, it might seem. I forget, I think it was, I have to look up the system. Somebody was asking what was this halogen, no, Novec something or other. I can look it up, but it's in the report that's in the link at the end of the presentation as well. So just quickly, as an example. Oh, can you go to the next slide? I keep forgetting. Okay, so briefly what I want to do is talk about the 2021 codes a little bit and where you kind of can find these provisions. And like I said, ironically, we're not focused in on the trigger to have these things. It's really just a matter, if you have these things, how they should be installed. And the IRC is coming a lot more into play these days because we're going to see a lot more of these in homes, in a residential setting, especially after California, after wildfires, when people found out that their PV actually was not for them. It was for, you know, offsite. They were sort of sharing in the generation of power. I think there's going to be a lot of market drivers that people are going to want all these systems. So we're reacting more to making sure that we know what all the safety features are. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm focusing on 2021 code since we just finished those, but in the IFC, the fire code, you will find in section 1207, it was 1206 in 2018. These provisions actually first really came into the code in 2018. Before that, we only had provisions on lead acid batteries that were really focused on essentially a hazmat exception for telecommunication facilities. That's all it dealt with. So this was expanded, put into its own chapter of all things sort of energy, and these provisions have been expanded even further to be consistent with what NFPA 855 now requires, which is their battery storage, energy storage system standard. We didn't actually reference it in 2021 because it wasn't, from the process standpoint, it wasn't quite ready that we could adopt it into the code, but it's very consistent with NFPA 855. We still limit an array size to 50 kilowatt hours, or you can test through UL 9548, which is like a performance fire test. So, but there's more focus on commissioning, decommissioning, operation and maintenance. those are all the things that would have helped, for instance, besides for the other, there's a lot of other requirements for gas detection, for ventilation, for spill control, depending on the energy technology. But all these pieces are found in 1207. IRC 328 is reflective, is actually residential in both pieces. Somebody had asked about Denver, what's commercial, what's not. Sort of the same thing. You can still have a 1 and 2 family home actually in the traditional building code that falls outside the scoping, for instance, of the residential code, which is certain height and things like that. But we consistently put the provisions so it's addressed in both places. Not as difficult to comply with as for commercial, but nonetheless, it's good to have those provisions for residential as well. Next slide, please. Stationary fuel cells. These aren't the topic of the day as much, at least in my realm. It's mostly energy storage systems, but there is a section 1206 that deals with this, and also in the residential code, R330, that references basically to NFPA 70 and NFPA 853 for compliance. And of course, anything electrical, anything, NFPA 70 compliance is always going to be part of that package. We always reference out to NFPA 70 for all the electrical. What we're looking at here is features to kind of, trigger these requirements to occur in compliance with any specific UL standards and things like that. Oh, next slide, please. PV, this was in the first presentation, actually. I mean, the reason we regulate this, it's both in the fire code and the residential code. We also deal with the structural piece of it too, but from a fire standpoint, we're focused on making sure the firefighters have access, safe access, that they understand what's energized, what's not. Obviously, compliance with NFPA 70, that's where the detail comes from for the electrical piece. BIPV, we've been dealing with that more and more, integrating those technologies. There's an exception, for those kinds of systems where you can actually cut into them and not be at risk from our electrical issues. And to a certain extent, we deal with ground mounted too, mostly keeping vegetation clear and things like that. Again, everything electrical will go back to 70 though. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this last one, again, this is back to the exterior wall, like the Grenfell fire. It's energy, it's more connected fire safety and energy efficiency kind of issue more than energy generation. But I think what's important about this is, so in the UK, they've essentially banned combustibles. I'm sure that as time goes on, they find better solutions and feel more comfortable regulatory-wise, what's getting on these buildings, who's approving, and things like that. But the US, there hasn't been any drastic change. We've been regulating this and requiring, we triggered this test in our exterior wall chapter 14 of the IBC, and chapter 26 for plastics, because we understand we need to have these materials, but we have to do it safely. And FPA 285 is based, you see a picture of the test. It is the complete wall system being tested. It is an expensive test, and there's going to be probably some more discussion as time goes on about engineering judgment and making sure maybe you could take the worst case scenario and walk it back, and maybe eventually even a guide of approved assemblies. But the key is that we don't say you can't have this material. What we're saying is you need to pass this test. And the system in the UK, not only was it on a non-sprinkler high-rise, but it didn't meet any of these things. It wouldn't have passed any of the exterior wall fire tests that are out in the world right now. It was done incorrectly. And in the Middle East, you've seen these fires as well. They turned out a little bit better because they were fully sprinklered high rises. You never want to see a fire like that in a building, of course, but the outcome was a lot different based on the fact that those buildings were newer and had a lot more features in them. But it's important to look at it as a performance, and that we need to keep the balance of meeting our energy goals, but also meeting the fire safety goals. And we've had some incidents in the US, and I've been chatting with jurisdictions here and there and wondering how the inspection process and installation process goes, the approval process, things like that. But I think it's good to look at this more holistically. Next slide, please. So these are just the links. I don't need to really chat about them, but the Surprise Arizona, the UL report is really good information, and also the National Fire Protection Research Foundation literally just came out, I think, last week. And I am on to the next slide. I'm looking forward to the discussion And my theme is I want all of these things to happen, and just to make sure that we're, you know, we can facilitate the process of making it happen smoothly and not derail the use of all these new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and other speakers. This was really informative and great. We're going to do a couple polls, and then we'll get to the discussion. As I said, we really would like to hear from the attendees, so please type your questions, comments into the chat box, and we'll call on people, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Start the discussion. That's the next poll. Tough one. Star Trek or Star Wars? The Force is strong. Interesting. That's fun. All right. And what's our next poll, Nicole? Youth codes are a good place to include new technologies. Couple more seconds. Yes. All right. Okay. Oh, we have one more, I forgot. Do you currently live or work in a jurisdiction with energy code requirements related to EV or solar? Interesting. Majority think yes, but a substantial number have concerns. So that could be a good point for discussion. All right. I think with that, we're on to discussion questions. Again, put them into the chat and we will take care of that. With that, I'm going to take a moderator privilege and ask the panelists a couple of questions here while more get put into the chat. It's going to be for all panelists, but particularly I think for Beth or Scott. You know, training and education are critical to understanding and enforcing these new technologies in buildings. You know, what do you think DOE or other organizations could do to help with that understanding of how to do that? I'll start with Beth.
You know, I was just thinking, it's been a little while, but I know there was an initiative with the DOE. A lot of things come into my way these days, but I know that they were working on checklists and things like that to help jurisdictions, code officials manage some of these new technologies. Though I do have a concern, we're going to start seeing such a flood of these new technologies in many jurisdictions that have so much to enforce as it is. I mean, I think of the local building official here, you know, a couple of years back, he was doing the IBC, and then they added the energy code and the existing building code. And, you know, I suspect there'll have to be some kind of regional approach to it. But I think DOE was working on some of that stuff. I just haven't really myself been able to keep up with some of those things.
Thanks. Scott or Chris, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think a big part of jurisdictions across the United States right now, this year and going into next year, our budgets are constrained significantly due to reduced revenue from sales tax and other components because of COVID. And it would be ideal if there were opportunities that could be provided to jurisdictions for both training of their staff, plan review, and inspection teams, as well as the professional community and the construction community. I think that budgets have really impacted us and the development communities across the United States. So if there was an opportunity to assist in bolstering that training, we would take advantage of it. I know Denver would big time take advantage of training if you had opportunities for us.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is that, you know, anytime there's a big jump in the code, I think it is worth acknowledging that, you know, we want to see progress in the code. We want to see these new technologies, and it can be challenging for home builders if they don't, you know, if they don't feel like they have the resources to understand the changes from, you know, the previous version that they had been using. So, you know, to the extent that DOE can provide that training, you know, get some buy-in and show, hey, you know, here's why we're doing this. Here are the benefits of this technology. Here's, you know, how you can explain it, and, you know, why you can sell this as you know, a win for the homeowner and the building owner. I think that's really valuable.
I would agree. Okay, I'm going to ask a deeply philosophical question on this next one. So what do you think the implication is from the overwhelming dominance of the Force in the Star Trek versus Star Wars question? Scott.
I'd have to say that early on, I was, I think, jaundiced because of the graphics were much better early on, and then I stuck with it. So I think the visual effects were better on the earlier ones then. So that's what got me.
Thanks. Chris?
I was wondering if it was a generational thing. You know, like I grew up watching the Star Wars movies. I wasn't as exposed to the Star Trek, but like I know my parents like watched all of it. So I was wondering if it's generational, but I'd be curious to find out more.
So everyone wants to send in their age. No, just kidding. Beth, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny. It brings back when Star Wars first came out. For some reason, my parents decided that I was old enough to see it, and my brother wasn't. And I thought it was the best thing ever. And I always remind him of that. He had to go see some little kid movie, but he's more into Star Wars than I am. But Star Wars, I don't know. There's something about it. Star Trek I've watched off and on, but Star Wars, and lately Mandalorian has gotten my family through the pandemic a little bit. So
The pandemic.
yeah.
Whatever gets you through the pandemic is pretty solid. Great. My next question is sort of, you know, what you see, but, you know, what technologies do you think have the best chance of success and big impact if included in building energy codes over the next cycle or two? I'll start this one with Chris.
Yeah, I can start with this one. I think, well, I'm a big fan or big proponent of like leveraging what others have done. So, you know, if we're looking and you know, Scott's showing us a great example of, you know, electric vehicle proposals, you know, that have worked well for them in Denver. I think if you could take that and adapt it to, you know, a model code or, you know, in other jurisdictions, I think that's a really smart move. I would say too that anything that has both energy efficiency and the grid flexibility components has both of those aspects, I think will have a bit better shot. So the classic example of that would be like a thermostat, like a smart thermostat that has both, you know, demand response capabilities and energy efficiency. I think new examples of that would be like heat pump water heaters, which are, you know, super energy efficient, and they also are grid connected. And then, you know, maybe something like connected lighting, where we have, you know, pretty good lighting requirements in, you know, in building codes right now. But then if there's an additional requirement to make them, you know, connected to the grid, I think that could have a great chance of success too.
Okay. Beth?
Can you remind me of the sort of the beginning and make sure I get the right kind of
No, I
response?
was just asking, you know, what technologies do you think have the best chance of success and big impact if they're incorporated into building codes over the next few cycles?
Beth, you're on mute right now.
I pushed it twice, sorry. ESS, you know, we have it in the fire code, of course. It's not required and it's not triggered by the other codes. But I think that, I don't know, I mean, I grapple with what is market driven or what needs to be regulatory. I mean, I think ultimately you need to push people to do some of these things. I mean, I live in Massachusetts, which is very much, I sort of call us the mini California sometimes. Wouldn't expect to see so many PV things in the Northeast, but we have them everywhere. We don't have my house yet, but there's a lot of incentives. I think incentives probably is sort of that next level, tax incentives. We also use the stretch code in Massachusetts, and communities get incentives and monies back for that. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know in terms of what is triggered. Maybe it's more about the energy generation piece, and then the storage would have to follow, maybe triggering that. I guess it gets to net zero. I'm not sure.
Right. Scott?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities for success with new technologies. I think solar has a great opportunity. The EVs, we have gotten some initial pushback because of upfront costs and whatnot. That one has a little bit more cost impact and maybe not an ROI on that one. So that one hurts a little bit more than solar, or at least solar you're getting return. I think there's opportunities too for like Denver. We're trying to be more progressive than what the base codes are, and so ramping up percentages of so if your base code is here for the IECC, that just ramping up percentages of energy savings in each code cycle, because we're local rule, we're able to have our amendments to those base codes. I think that's success that we have, and I think like Chris had mentioned, we're looking at in our next code cycle coming up, communicating grid equipment, so it can be, whether it be a hot water heater or thermostat or something that definitely has overrides on it, though, because I do have concerns over some of that with certain facilities, both medical or senior citizens. You know, just that they can maintain control when they need to. If someone has pneumonia, we certainly don't want to turn the temperature down, right? So there has to be opportunities for override on that. But I think there are great opportunities, especially Denver is going to probably be experiencing in years to come what California is with peak demand, and you know, hopefully we don't get to that duck curve, that it's more consistent, and with different storage and other things we can ride through that a little bit more gracefully than California is right now. But I think there are great opportunities in almost every realm of energy savings.
Great. We've got a couple of things coming in the chat here. I'm going to give people a chance to talk. Mike Collignon, you've been pretty busy in the chat, and you did have one thing about stretch codes. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask it. Otherwise, I'll just ask the panel to comment on stretch codes opportunities. Okay. So we'll go to the panel on stretch code opportunities. Why don't we start with Scott on that?
Yeah, I think we were really lucky. I was able to get a grant to start our first stretch code because we needed consultant help and whatnot. And with this new stretch code that we have, our green code, we're really excited about it. So the idea was to create this stretch code that ultimately would be an option. And then as our code cycles happen, we pull pieces of it from each chapter that become base and then further the stretch. In this first year of launching our stretch code, we've actually created a pilot program where 5 projects, the first in the door, we have one that's signed up now, will get an expedited review, basically cutting in half all of our cycles, and they get up to a $50,000 fee reduction in their permit fee. And by doing that, it's sort of promoting their stretch code to the professionals and contractors and developers in Denver so they get more familiar with it as it progresses to partial base, partial stretch code. It also, this sort of pilot's going to help us understand what are the staffing requirements in each of the different agencies? Because now we're sort of crossing boundaries of what our code normally used to do. Normally, we were just sort of in a world of building and fire, transportation, or basic reviews that we'd have. But now this is sort of more like a lead project where it has water conservation, it has other aspects, renewables, and all these other components that someone has to review. So then we look at what staffing is required now through a pilot, and then we can go to council and mayor next year and say, hey, this is the staff we need if we want to truly make this a priority in Denver. And we're doing the same thing with a pilot with affordable housing. So if we want to say, hey, affordable housing is a priority and sustainable design is a priority in Denver, here's the staff we need, and we can expedite those projects. So I think there's some great opportunities for cities and counties, jurisdictions across the United States to use stretch codes to test the waters of what their priorities are, instead of just throwing out a mandate. And you can get the feedback from the development community if you push too hard, if it's too hard to get there, or if it's too uncertain. So I think they're a great opportunity to help you get to your goals maybe a little bit quicker and help the development community get used to a stretch code before it's required.
Right, I agree. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge Harold Jepson's comment in the chat, because I think it ties in with what Mike said about stretch codes. So I think stretch codes play a role along with a lot of other potential outlets like certification programs like LEED, like we talked about, optional compliance paths. Harold mentions that, or flexible like credits or points in the code. Like all of these can serve as kind of like a testing ground for some of these new technologies where you can, try them out. It's not required by everybody, but if somebody chooses to use it and chooses to adopt it, then, it's a way to try it and see if it works. And then, you can bring it to the national model code, such as like the IECC in that process, or maybe, in the ASHRAE 90.1 standard, and say, we have this provision, it's worked in these settings, here's the feedback we've received, let's try and incorporate this into the code. So I think there are a lot of different avenues, like stretch codes, or other voluntary provisions or pathways that can serve that function for these new technologies.
So I have, this is Ian from P&L. So I have a question for Scott specifically, and then maybe Chris, if you could jump in a little bit on this as well. What advice would you give? I know we have a number of jurisdictions on this call. What advice would you give to a jurisdiction seeking to add EV or solar ready language into their building codes? I know you said there was some pushback, certainly from the development community on some of those provisions. So any advice that you would extend?
Yeah, great question. We did have some learning curves, and we had a very robust community process. When we did our Denver code amendment process, we followed the sort of the national model. So we had code committees for each of the different books, and one specifically for the IECC. And I think the development community was not aware that the EV was something that we were discussing, even though we kept pushing out. We have a meeting today, here's the agenda on the meeting, and it was done through web, through newsletters. I even presented to Ludi beforehand about highlighting those items that would impact cost tremendously or have a significant impact with cost with a project. So it was really out there before council voted on this amendment, and then it gets amended, and then suddenly we realized the errata, like it wasn't impacting as many people because of that zoning code issue, where the way we were applying it was if it was required by zoning code. Well, most of the central business district where you're providing parking spaces doesn't have a mandate. So we were missing out on a good part of what was some unintended consequences. So our Errata is coming out to fix that. I think we probably would have gotten more pushback earlier when it first got released if they were aware of that. And so my advice would be to reach out specifically to ULI, to the development communities, to BOMA, NIAP, real estate groups, and have them more involved in that process before the code amendment process to help work through appropriate criteria, appropriate percentages, so that the impact isn't overwhelming, and work out some of the details. Like we recently worked out some of the, you can picture if you've got an outdoor sort of strip mall scenario, you don't want to put all of the EV chargers in front of one store. They should be evenly distributed from an accessibility point of view. You certainly don't want someone that needs a handicap accessible space, but they want a half a mile away. They want that retail store a half mile away. So there are components that are important from a code perspective that you really need in there, but you have to work out how to get them to be affordable for the development community in the scenarios that they're used to developing. That would be my one recommendation, to have those specific folks involved in the dialogue.
That's great. So Chris, and thank you for that, Scott. I think that's excellent feedback and good advice. Chris, my kind of follow-up question on that for you. You mentioned that there are the 3 proposals in the 2021 IECC that were more focused on electrification, kind of ready type of components. And there's been some discussion about that in the chat. So, curious, how can jurisdictions that are interested in that get that information easily? Are there resources out there? Is IEEE working with certain jurisdictions that are interested in incorporating those provisions in their code? So anything you can say about that?
Sure, that's a really great tee up to what I was hoping to talk about here anyway. And I think a good thing to mention too is, like Scott comes from, Denver. Denver has a lot of great resources to use. Some of the jurisdictions, who might be listening to this or considering these options maybe don't have, the resources to really, create their own or do the research necessary. So, yeah, I would say that, this has all happened fairly recently, and we don't have anything available right now as far as resources for those jurisdictions. But we certainly plan to. I'm not exactly sure what it'll look like yet, but I would say in the meantime, for anybody that's interested in this, you can reach out to us. But there are a lot of organizations like ours that are, we are invested in this. We want to promote energy efficiency, grid flexibility in the code. So I was trying to write down from memory a list. And so, whoever you talk to, it's probably somebody you already work with or know, just reach out to them and they can point you in the right direction. But some of those organizations are like NASIO, IMT, us, ACEEE, NBI, New Buildings Institute, Alliance to Save Energy, or your local regional energy efficiency organization. So, if you're in the Midwest, me is a great example. And just reach out and say, hey, we're interested in doing this. Can you help us talk about it, or can you point us, to somebody who can? Our types of organizations are here to help with that. So yes, we plan to provide resources. I don't have anything to point to at this specific moment, but in the meantime, we would love to have those conversations.
Excellent, thanks. And it looks like there's a question in the chat that I think we missed. This is specifically for Scott, it looks like. What third-party certifications are required in Denver? Or if not required, what do you approve in terms of third-party certifications for energy code? And then it looks like there's also kind of another component to this question on energy disclosure. But I guess answer the first question first, and then we can go to the second.
Yeah, so we adopted the IECC, and we pulled forward a lot of the 2021. So we adopted the 2018 and pulled forward, and then added or modified some things to be specific to Denver. So now we're having building commissioning as part of our criteria for commercial buildings now, and blower door tests. So there's both a, normally we would just be doing residential, single family, duplex, multifamily, blower door. We've been at 4 air changes required for multifamily, 3 air changes required for single family, and then we allow 4 for ADUs as well, an exception. We've ramped that up now in our most recent code amendment so that commercial projects require blower door as well. There aren't penalties, but it's more of what we did is a stepping stone in this code so that we make the blower door required. And if you don't pass, then you have to have mitigation plan, and then you have your contractors go around and do whatever X, Y, and Z was in terms of mitigation, and then you submit that report to us. There's no penalty if you don't make it, but you have to show that you tried to mitigate where you failed. And that could be demonstrated through smoke tests and other things that they can see where the leakage is happening. We're also requiring the building envelope to be commissioned, not just the systems to be commissioned, because the systems in certain size buildings already have that, but now we've got full commissioning for the full building, and those third party have to be included when the commissioning report is submitted prior to TCO or CO. And that could be a preliminary report, because obviously the commissioning report won't be done until probably a year after the project is occupied. So those are 2 of the third party components that are really important to us in our most recent code amendment process.
Great, thank you. And then there's a question on Colorado passed an energy disclosure requirement on potential real estate sales. And do you believe there has been any positive effect on energy efficiency attributed to that, or do you think it's simply raised awareness? I think you're muted, Scott.
I'm on the AIA Government Affairs Committee, where we look at all of those, and it selfishly helps me from my perspective from the building department and how the city and county weighs in on certain statutes going through. And on that one, I don't remember that one being raised specifically to us. So I'm not as familiar with it, because it must have been a lower impact in regards to us as a building department and the AIA. I do know that there's and so I think that one is more of an awareness piece that happened. I do know that we're actively looking at both we already have implemented this in Denver from a city and county perspective, where we have the benchmarking. You've probably seen different jurisdictions require benchmarking. We have a 90% adoption rate in Denver for benchmarking. The state has not required that yet, so we're working on a statute. We're trying to get a representative to work with us on this, but to have that benchmarking. And I think that will be a bigger leap for Colorado if we can pass that. I know we've had great success now in Denver at 90% again adoption rate, and so that everyone that has a building, a commercial building, they're giving us their benchmarking energy use. And then moving forward, we're actually in that next phase now, looking at, okay, what improvements, and we're seeing improvements being made year over year without any requirements. And then there'll be the next step will be, okay, if you have a building by this year, X amount of energy improvement must happen, or maybe there'll be penalties or some other thing. We're not sure how we're going to get there, but it's really an important tool to at least show a baseline of where buildings are and which ones really need improvement. I think that would be probably the best help, more than the bill that you're mentioning, I think, which was a lower impact bill.
Certainly. Thanks for that. So I'll kind of open it up to anybody else in the audience that wants to ask a question. So seeing no other questions in the chat bar, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But again, thanks to our great speakers today, and thanks for your questions today. It's an emerging topic, and certainly one that we're very interested in at PNNL and Department of Energy, and so we've definitely noted opportunities for, for training and resources to be made available. So I think all that is really excellent information. And just looking ahead again for our National Energy Codes Conference seminar series, we have 2 additional presentations. So next week at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have a discussion on policies for energy efficiency and resilience. And so that'll be hosted by the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. And then we'll also have a discussion on field studies in the Northwest region the week after. So we hope that you can join us and certainly continue to access that link below for recordings of the webinars and then also PDFs of the presentations. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again, and we hope you'll join us next time to continue the conversation.
This has been the National Energy Codes Conference Seminar Series hosted by the U.S. Department of Energy. Join us each week for a number of other important topics in building energy codes, just like today's. We're here every Thursday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern. Participate live in our upcoming events or listen to past events on demand through our energycodes.gov training portal. There you'll find other helpful tools and resources, from education and training materials to compliance tools like our ResCheck and ComCheck software, to the latest on state code updates, to analysis of energy code impacts from energy savings to cost effectiveness, and more. Check out energycodes.gov for those and a number of other technical assistance resources from DOE, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and others. From the DOE Building Energy Codes program, we hope you learned something new about energy codes and enjoyed today's session. Thanks for being part of the conversation, and we'll see you next time.